What up guys, Joachim here. In this video I'm going to continue my discussion from yesterday where I was discussing Bible translation. So yesterday's video centered very much on the appropriateness of the Septuagint for translations into English of Orthodox Christian Bibles. I showed a few examples of Bibles that are often used by the church. I expressed some desire, I guess would be a good way to say that, for translations that exhibited a consistency in the wording between the scriptures and the liturgy that is used in the Orthodox Church, as well as that is both an Orthodox translation for both the Old and New Testaments, the Septuagint and the New Testament. And those were my main desires. Also that it be in normal, understandable English. So when you go to the liturgy, if it's in English, whether it be in the Greek Orthodox Church or any of the Orthodoxies really, if it's Russian Orthodox and they do the service in English, if it's Antiochian Orthodox and they do the service in English, which most of them do, then they're usually very understandable. Like it's good English, but the translations sometimes don't. I think, in my opinion, they don't exhibit that. They're not as consistent with that. So that was kind of the big thing for yesterday, and I wanted to kind of make a point that I guess could be interpreted as being contradictory. I don't really think it is, but it adds to the point that even though I do think that the Septuagint is the most appropriate scripture to base our translations on for the Orthodox Church, I'm also not anti-Hebrew Bible. And the reason that I say that is because we are the apostolic church. We are the church that holds the faith of the apostles. And the apostles quoted 1/3 of the time from the Hebrew Bible. When you read the New Testament, 2/3 of the quotations are from the Septuagint. There may be other reasons for that or factors, namely that they were writing in Greek, and the Septuagint was a Greek Bible, like it was a translation by the 72 elders. Currently, it is the oldest manuscript of the Bible that we have, except for those that are that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I guess it depends on how you define older. So the Septuagint goes back a few hundred years before the time of Christ. But we don't have like a we don't have a manuscript from that time period. We have manuscripts from after that time period. So if the manuscripts that we have in hand, full manuscripts of the Bible, the oldest would definitely be the Septuagint. But there are fragments of scripture of the Hebrew Bible that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that make up, quite a bit. You can get certain portions of the Torah and many of the prophets and those books from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those would be older. Those fragments would be older. There is an entire scroll of Isaiah, the prophet, that is completely intact from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that is a very important find for people who care about Scripture. And so, all of that bearing in mind, about 1/3 of the time, the quotations that we see in the New Testament, which is written in Greek, they line up more closely with 2/3 of the time, they line up more closely with the Septuagint wording of passages than they do the Hebrew Bible. But now the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew and the Septuagint's written in Greek. So the apostles writing in Greek, it also kind of makes sense that their quotations and what they write will line up more with the Greek Bible. During the time of the temple, we know from writings that there were 3 scrolls, and So these were scroll families. The Masoretes who came, I don't remember what century, is quite a few hundred years after the first century, but they presumably had one of those family of scrolls. So when the Romans burned Jerusalem to the ground, destroyed the temple, and drove the people largely out, not entirely, but they drove a lot of the people out, there a lot of stuff was lost. So there were in the temple reportedly 3 scrolls, and what they would do is that they would take 2 scrolls, and when they matched, they would take the 2, and if they're reading from scripture, they'll take 2 that matched, and if there was any contradictory part in any of them, and that would be the one that was used. So presumably those were all in Hebrew, and one of those was the family of scrolls that the Septuagint was translated from. So there was the Septuagint family of scrolls. Even though the Septuagint's in Greek, it came from a family of scrolls that was originally in Hebrew, which was different from the family of scrolls that the Masoretic text that the Hebrew Bible is in today was in. So the question really comes down to how different are these translations, and were they changed? Was language a part in it? And those are all good questions to ask. If we're considering the apostles and Jesus, 1/3 of the time quoted from the modern, from what we have today, not the modern, but they weren't modern, they were 2,000 years ago. But if they quoted from the text of the Masoretic text that still exists today, the Hebrew Bible for them, they didn't know who the Masoretes were. The Masoretes didn't exist. They wouldn't exist for hundreds and hundreds of years after the time of Christ. But the Hebrew Bible for them, the one that we have today. So if 1/3 of the time they quote from that, we can't really say, I think, that it is wrong. It's less appropriate for the Orthodox Church than the Greek Bible is, but I don't really feel that it's justified in maintaining the faith of the apostles to refuse to acknowledge the Bible that they quoted from. So the question then is, did the Masoretes, did people change? Did they change this text so that it no longer reflects the Bible that the apostles and that Christ read from? Well, up until the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that would have been something that we couldn't answer. The church would have just had to say the Septuagint is our scripture, and no matter what anyone else says, we have to stick to that. But because we do have fragments, and we do have an entire scroll of Isaiah, then I think we have to reconsider that argument. Of course, that argument is, that's been more than 100 years ago, I think, since the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, or nearly 100 years ago. So it's not really a recent event. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we look at them, there are grammatical differences, there are spelling differences that sometimes exist in the words between the 1st century and the Masoretic text of certain passages. But do they change the meaning? Would they make a major difference between what's written in Greek and what's written in Hebrew, and how we would, as I'm an English speaker, how I would understand that? And the answer generally is no. They don't seem to make a difference. The biggest difference that usually is brought up is the passage that I read in the last video that I made on this topic, which looked at Isaiah chapter 7, where it says that a virgin in the Septuagint, it says that a virgin shall be with child, whereas in the Masoretic text, it says a young woman, Alma, shall be with child. I made a previous video where I discussed this a little bit more in depth, and I'll make a few of those points in a moment, but I did want to point out that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scroll of Isaiah that was found from the time of Christ, like, it actually did say Alma. So, we can't keep, what's been found is that we can't keep making this argument that the Masoretes changed the text to reflect their beliefs. I think Maybe you can make an argument that they removed books of the Bible because they didn't like that they pointed to Christ, like those books that the Protestants erroneously and heretically call apocryphal. There are apocryphal books, of course, that were not accepted by the church, like I mentioned in the last video, some of those, but the ones that are part of the Septuagint, like Maccabees and Baruch and Judith and Tobit and the Book of Wisdom, these were not they were not apocryphal. They were part of the Scripture. So there's that. The other point that I had made in a previous video where I discussed was that in the Isaiah scroll, we see this word Almah, which generally would be today translated as young woman. One of my thoughts on this idea was that in ancient Judaism, a young woman, a young adolescent woman, would have naturally been a virgin. And when the 72 elders, that's where we get the term Septuagint from, is from the translation of the 70 elders or 72 elders. They in translating this for a Greek, and this is pagan Greece. This is not the ancient. This is not the Christian Greece that came to exist after the time of Christ. This was when Greek culture, Greek people were still in the pagan cult. So there were cult prostitutes. There were gods that celebrate. When you read those stories, there's all kinds of celebration of sexual immorality and debauchery and those kinds of things. So I think there's a good possibility that the word Almah for the ancient Hebrews was a virgin, and it was just assumed that would be a virgin. Once you became a married woman, maybe the word Almah was not used any longer. Kind of the way that in English we would say Miss versus Mrs. So once you get married, usually you may still be called a miss, especially if somebody wants to flatter you, but more typically, once you get married, you'll become known as a Mrs. as opposed to a miss. So whether that was the case in ancient Hebrew, I don't think that can easily be determined. And I think there's a good possibility that when they translated that into Greek, understanding that the Greeks had a lot of these sexual, differences between the way that sexual culture was in ancient pagan Greece versus the very modest, very covenant-based, marriage that happened between man and woman for the ancient Hebrews. So I think probably they were taking the meaning of the word for them in Hebrew and trying to convey that this was not some kind of loose woman. This was not a cult prostitute. This was not a just any woman. This was a chaste woman, and that would have been just a young woman for any Hebrew in ancient times. So I think probably that went at least a little bit into why they might have translated it that way. And we, in a modern culture, trying to look back at ancient times, may not be able to identify as well with that because the idea of being a young woman automatically making her a virgin may not exist as well today in our culture. And so it's difficult for even our translators and for people trying to look at this to identify in that way. I don't know. I can't really speak to it. I just know that the scroll that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was from around the time of Christ, and that it said Almah. So, that's the way I would look at it and the way that I understand it. But, given that Jesus and the apostles, when they quote, and even in a Greek Bible, even the Greek New Testament, when they quote, about 1/3 of the time it lines up with what we know to be today the Masoretic Hebrew Bible. So 2/3 of the time, the majority of the time, they are quoting from the Septuagint, and that's why it's the most appropriate text of scripture for the church. There's also the Peshitta, which is a Aramaic translation, but at least for the New Testament, the evidence strongly suggests that the Peshitta was a translation from the Greek Septuagint into the Aramaic, and that I don't know about the Old Testament portion of the Peshitta. I don't speak Syriac Greek or Syriac Aramaic well enough to even begin to interact with that. So I don't really even speak Greek well enough, but I do speak quite a bit of Hebrew, and hopefully as my Greek improves, I'll have more insights to that as well. But those are just some of my thoughts on translations. I still think that for Orthodox Christians, the Septuagint is the most appropriate text of scripture. It's the most complete. It has all of our books, whereas in the Hebrew Bible, many of the books of our church, of our Bible, would be missing. So, you know, those are factors that I think play into that. Yeah, so that's about it. If you guys have any questions or comments or thoughts, please post them in the comment section below, and I would love to hear kind of what you guys have to say on some of that. You take it easy, and I will talk to you in a video coming very soon.